Right. What I want to talk about today then is a biosocial perspective on criminality. So hopefully the case we talked about last time really drew your attention to the fact that there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle, right, that go to explaining why someone becomes a criminal. And this includes both biological factors and social factors, right? And quite often they interact with each other. So we mainly talked about some biological factors in the course, but I'm sure you're familiar with some social risk factors also for violence. So what are some of the ones you know about?
Just like we talked about with the last guy, like being, wait. Well, you said biological, but like growing up in like a foster home, like being away from mom, like that's social. Right?
Sure, that's a social factor, right? Yeah. So
I second guess myself.
yeah, no maternal abandonment, right? In that case. Yeah, what else?
Poverty.
Yep, poverty. Abby?
Peer groups.
Sure, like an antisocial peer group,
Yeah.
or bullying or exclusion, anything like that. Yeah.
Abuse.
Yeah, abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, right? Neglect. Yeah, maltreatment.
Like substances count as social if it's like a biological thing that like changes you?
It would be more biological, right? Because that's what's having the impact. But you could say maybe peer pressure from a group, maybe could be a social factor. Yeah, and then we could talk about, different parenting styles as well, right? If it's maybe too authoritarian or too permissive, right? Rather than some ideal, moderate middle ground. Okay, so to kind of illustrate this, I'll briefly mention the case of Henry Lee Lucas. Does anyone know who this is? Anyone familiar with this case before?
I already looked at the slide, so yeah, it's criminal.
So also known as the confession killer. Okay, he confessed to over 600 murders, the vast majority of which were unproven. Okay, he was convicted of 3 murders, and the estimates are around 20 when experts in this have an idea over how many they think he actually killed. But he had a pretty terrible upbringing that we can look at for some source of understanding why he became who he was. So his father was a homeless man who was an alcoholic and was completely absent, and his mother was much worse. Okay, his mother was physically abusive and emotionally abusive. Okay, and would call him names, made him dress up as a girl to go to school, to humiliate him. He was given a pet mule by his uncle. He would go see this pet mule in a nearby field. His mother asked, "Do you like this mule?" He said yes. She pulled out a gun and shot it. And then when she had to pay for the carcass to be removed, she beat him, okay, blaming him for the financial burden. And she was a prostitute, and they lived in a 1-room motel room. Okay, so he would witness her with her clients. They also lived with her pimp called Bernie, and he was physically assaulted. Okay, they were in extreme poverty. He didn't get fed. Okay, the food would go to her, to Bernie, to the siblings. He would get sometimes leftovers, but for the most part, he would eat from the trash can in the parking lot of the motel. One time he was beaten over the head so hard with a wooden board by his mother for not cleaning the motel to her standards that it knocked him unconscious, and he was then on the motel floor for 3 days, okay, in a semi-conscious state. It was Bernie the pimp who actually took him to hospital, who actually had some concern before his mother did. His mother was his first victim, and all of his other victims were female. Okay, it's not hard to imagine why he would have such a hatred, okay, towards women, towards people, okay, especially of course towards his mother. And if you listen to interviews with him or look at extracts from interviews online, the hatred he has for people is evident, okay, and killing for him was easy. It was nothing at all, okay. He had no emotional impact when it came to do this. So, I mean, we can see a whole range of, yes, social factors, but also how they interact with biological factors, right? The extreme poverty and the malnourishment would have had a negative impact on his brain development, right? And then the persistent physical abuse also likely would have caused damage and brain impairments. So what I want to focus on is how biology interacts with the social factors, okay? And there's really two main types of interactions, okay? There's moderating interactions in which a third variable, okay, moderates the relationship between two other variables, okay? Perhaps moderates the strength of it, okay? And then the other type is a mediation, okay? In which there is an association between two variables, so the independent variable, the dependent variable, x and y, okay? But it's actually being explained by additional factors, okay? Now, if you want to know whether it's a mediator or a moderator, if it's a moderator, the moderator is not impacted by the IV, okay? Whereas in mediation, it is. So, you know, we have the outcome variable x, and then, so the independent variable, the predictor variable x, right? And then the dependent variable or outcome variable y, hence variable. And then z is either going to be the mediator or the moderator, right? So let's say, just to illustrate what I'm talking about simply, the predictor variable mainly, in this case, perhaps is exercise, okay? And then the outcome variable is weight loss, okay? Obviously, that's going to have an impact, okay? Exercising will have an impact on weight loss, okay? Maybe I predict that this association, okay, the association between exercise and weight loss is impacted by gender. Maybe that will have something to do with the relationship. Is gender going to be a mediator or a moderator in this example? Well, does exercise impact gender? Right, so it has to be a moderator, right? Because gender is not going to change based upon exercise, right? So it would have to be a moderator. But maybe I also think how much you eat will have something to do with the relationship, okay? Maybe that will interact with this. In that case, that could be a mediator, right? Because how much you exercise might impact how much you eat. And then that, of course, might also impact weight gain, right? So that's how to tell if it's a mediator or a moderator, right? X impacts the mediator, X does not impact the moderator, okay? Now, in the studies that we're talking about, when we're talking about moderation, it's mainly going to be in the form of a double hit, okay? A kind of double whammy effect. So it might be the case that, for example, physical abuse increases the odds of violence, okay? So in that case, abuse is X and violence is Y. And it might be the case also that if one is intellectually impaired, if there's also a biological risk factor, that relationship is heightened, okay? The relationship between abuse and violence is even higher, okay, than if one is not intellectually impaired, okay? So in that case, there's a double hit, right? A double whammy effect, okay? That would be an example of moderation. So I'm going to show you some examples throughout today's class of moderation and mediation, so that you can for sure tell the difference between the two and give examples for each. But some of these examples we've actually already talked about. You maybe just haven't thought about it through this lens. So this is a study we talked about a few weeks ago in Copenhagen, Denmark. Right, we have a group of controls, a group who have social risk factors. This was maternal rejection, and then biological risk factors, which were in the form of birth complications leading to oxygen deprivation and other factors that may have impacted the brain. And then there was the fourth group, which had both the biological and social risk factors, right? And it was here that we saw the most substantial increase in violence, right? Once one was an adult, it was a threefold increase. So in this case, by including the social factors, it's moderated, right, the impact that biology has on violence. Or you could look at it the other way around. By including biology, we've moderated the impact that the social risk factors had on violence, okay? So in this case, it's a double hit, right? It's a double whammy effect. Only once we had both of these factors, okay, did we then get the increased odds of violence. And this study was replicated, right, on an all African American sample in Philadelphia, and then was replicated in subsequent studies as well. Another example that we've already looked at from near the beginning of the course was the impact of the low activity variant of the MAOA gene, right? So in this case, the red line is the group who has the low activity variant of the MAOA gene, and the blue line is that which has the typical variant, okay? And then what we're looking at here is a group of participants who did not receive any maltreatment as children, those who received probable maltreatment, and then those who had pretty severe maltreatment, right? What we find is if we look at this first group, so when there was no maltreatment, the MAOA gene had no impact on antisociality, right? But if we combine this risk factor with severe maltreatment, then suddenly we've got a much higher increased risk of antisociality, right? Again, it's moderating, well, in this case, maltreatment is moderating the impact of this gene, right? And again, it's a double hit example, right? Once one has the double whammy, once they have the effect from both biology and the social, then they're at the most highest level of risk when it comes to violence in this study. Yeah, I mean,
Does double hit imply that it can be like swapped either direction? Like with that example, like one moderates, like including.
it doesn't have to. Only one could be significant on its own. Yeah. Or the other one could be significant, or in the previous example, none of them were significant on their own, right? It was only the case of when there was both. Or in this study here, we're looking at how maybe minor physical abnormalities interact with family stability. So the blue line have low to normal levels of minor physical abnormalities, right? That would be the list that we looked at a few weeks ago that indicate disruption to fetal development. And then the red line rather, the red line is the group that have a high number of these minor physical abnormalities, right? And we looked at a whole range of disruptors to fetal development, right, that may cause some of these minor abnormalities. And then we're also looking at family stability. Okay, did they come from stable homes, or did they come from homes in which there was multiple marriages and divorces? Okay, so in this case, if they came from a stable home, it had no impact whether one had these minor physical abnormalities or not. Okay, it was only in the case of living in this unstable environment in which these minor physical abnormalities, which we know correspond with executive function impairments and so on, right? It was only then that there was then the significant substantial increased risk of violence if one had these minor physical abnormalities. And then 9 years later, the study replicated more or less a different outcome variable, this time conduct disorder. Okay. But again, finding that in the presence of both the minor physical abnormalities and coming from a socially disadvantaged background, okay, that again together they cause a threefold increase in conduct disorder diagnoses. Okay. Another similar study, okay, this time 3 groups, a group who live in poverty, but they don't experience abuse or have any known birth complications or neuromotor deficits, okay, but they live in poverty. And then we have a second group who did experience birth complications, okay, birth complications that would have caused oxygen deprivation and killed neurons in the brain and so on. And we know from other measurements also do have neuromotor deficits, okay, impairments in executive function as a consequence. And then there is a biosocial group who also have these birth complications and who also have these neuromotor deficits, okay, but who also came from backgrounds in which there was instability and frequent conflict within the household, okay, constant verbal fighting, marital conflict. Now this time, when we look at violent crime rates, we're breaking it down. First of all, crime in general, and then just thievery, and then violent crimes, okay, so this would be assault and murder. And what we find is, no matter what the type of crime is, this third group is always the one at the most heightened risk, okay, of violence, and significantly higher than the others, okay? In fact, this is the smallest group within the study, and yet they were responsible for more than 70% of the crimes committed in this sample, okay? So another example of this double hit effect, okay? We could also get an example of moderation, not just from looking at what increases the risks of violence, but maybe also looking at how successful interventions are, okay? This is missing the citation, but it's Raine et al. 2003.
Can you say that again?
Raine and colleagues, 2003. So what we have here is a study done in Mauritius in which there is an enrichment program targeted to decrease the risk of becoming violent or antisocial once one is older. So this enrichment program takes place between 3 and 5 when one would be at nursery, okay? The control group are going to just a normal nursery, okay, before one goes to school. The enrichment program contains a hot, healthy meal every day. It's a salad and fish or chicken or mutton with milk and a fruit juice. So they're having, a healthy source of food every day that they're at the nursery. It includes 2.5 hours a day of physical exercise. This includes outdoor activities and other gym activities. And it includes education programs, drama, art, music, and other number of workshops. Okay, so additional programs than one would get in comparison to just the typical nursery environment. Okay, so what we want to find is, did this enrichment program successfully reduce the number of conduct disorders, okay, 12 years later, once one was assessed at age 17? But we can split it based upon those who came from a good nutrition background, okay, in which they came from a home in which they were well fed, there was good nutrition, okay, and a group who came from a household in which there was poor nutrition, okay, in which they weren't well fed, they didn't have the same, nutrients and vitamins and minerals and so on that we talked about that are crucial for healthy brain development and so on. And also, more likely, they had mothers also who might have been malnourished or not eating healthily during fetal development. Okay, and then what we found is, did the enrichment program successfully reduce conduct disorders? Well, in both groups, yes, it did. But in the good nutrition group, it was a small effect. Okay, it reduced it by 9%. It's still significant, but it's a fairly small effect. Okay, it's an expensive program, this enrichment program. It's also having more staff per student, okay, than one would get in a typical nursery environment. So if we're going to persuade, the government, for example, to fund a program like this, we would need to demonstrate it's going to be highly successful. But what we find is, in the group who had the poor nutrition, conduct disorders are reduced by half. Okay, it's a strong effect this time. Okay, about 53% reduction in conduct disorders. So in this case, another example of moderation, right? Did the enrichment program have an effect? Yes, it did, but even more so in cases of children coming from poor nutrition backgrounds. Okay. Questions? Okay. Now, this is an interesting study from Australia. It's a longitudinal study in which we're having assessments at various points in time, and we're measuring social risk, okay, based upon poverty, but also the mothers, once they give birth, are filling out a questionnaire on how much they wanted the child, how irritable they feel by their child's cries, how much they want to hit their own baby once the baby is emotional. We then follow up 5 years later once the child is 5 years old. And again, the mother gives a questionnaire response. How much now do they actually hit their child? Okay, how much do they use physical discipline? How much do they closely monitor their child? How warm are they towards their child? Okay. And then once the child is a teenager, okay, there's another assessment, this time retrospectively done by the child. Okay, how warm was your mother? How closely were you monitored by your mother? Okay. And then we also look at instability. Okay, was this a stable home environment, or was there multiple relationships and multiple divorces in the child's background? And then we're also measuring biological risk. Okay, we look at birth complications, the same ones I've already discussed. And then at these same points in time that we were doing these previous assessments, we're also having the child undergo IQ tests and verbal IQ tests and other measurements of executive function, okay, the ones we looked at in the neurocognition lecture. And so we have a very broad overview, right, of social risk and of biological risk in this study. And then what we're measuring once the children are teenagers is their aggressive behavior. And again, this is a pretty broad instrument. We're looking at, have they actually committed a crime that they've maybe been convicted for or got into trouble for, been disciplined for, but also they're filling out a questionnaire on, do you carry a weapon? How frequently do you carry a weapon? Have you taken someone from someone using a weapon? Have you thrown bottles at people and cars? Have you thrown stones at houses, people, cars? And how often have you physically hurt someone and so on? Okay, so that's the outcome variable this time, this level of aggressiveness. Now, what we found is if one comes from a low social risk background, biology didn't really have an impact in this study, okay? Regardless of whether they had the high biological risk, it made no difference. If they came from the low social risk background, there's low levels of aggression either way. But only once we get to the high social risk group do these high biological risk factors then substantially increase the odds of violence. And it's a large increase, right? It's about 3 to 4-fold increase. So another example of moderation, right, and of this double hit effect. You keeping up so far? So in those cases, what we're seeing for the most part in those cases was that biology had no role to play on its own. It was only when it was paired with social risk factors that biology then heightened the risk of violence, right? But on its own, biology didn't really seem to have much of a role to play. But then how do we explain some cases of criminals who come from good backgrounds? Okay, what I have on the slides, or on the slide here, is a number of school shooters, right? We have Andrew Golden, Mitchell Johnson from Arkansas, Kip Kinko from Oregon, and then the most well-known or most covered of school shootings is the Columbine case, right? No case has been displayed in movies and TV and written about quite as much as this case. Now, perhaps with the exception of Mitchell Johnson did come from a home in which his mother had divorced his father and then married a criminal who was in jail at the time. But it was not extreme in comparison to some of the other criminal cases that we've looked at, his background. But the others came from good backgrounds, broadly speaking. Eric's older brother was a star athlete, right? Dylan's mother was horrified by the Columbine shootings, and she's written quite a lot on how shocked she was. And all of these individuals came from middle-class backgrounds in which their parents were pretty well educated, okay? So how do we then explain this? If there was no abuse, there was no neglect, there was no poverty, and so on. Well, in 2012, Lawrence Miller, police psychologist from Florida, wrote a good paper which gave an overview over all the American school shooters that there was up to that point in 2012. And he argued that they could all be split into three categories, okay? Now, there was one group, the traumatized shooters, who were impacted by their environment, who did come from bad, abusive backgrounds in which there was easy access to guns and fascination with guns in the household. But the other two groups came from good backgrounds, and this included the largest group, okay, the largest group of school shooters, which was the psychotic killer group, the group who had mental illness of some kind, in most cases, severe depression, suicidal tendencies. In the case of Kip Kinkle, paranoid schizophrenia, okay. Dylan also belongs in this group of the psychotic killers, severely depressed and suicidal, okay. Thought that, Eric was really the one who kind of took charge, if you like, in the planning of that event. Sometimes you hear that Dylan was kind of slow. He wasn't very verbal, but I don't think there's good evidence he was actually intellectually impaired, okay, but severely depressed. And then Mitchell Johnson in this review is classed as a traumatic shooter because he comes from a less good background. But what about Andrew Golden and Eric Harris? Okay, they have no mental disorder to speak of, okay, or at least not a mental illness, okay, and they don't come from bad backgrounds, okay. Again, they come from good middle class backgrounds in which there was good emotional support, okay. Their siblings turns out to be successful members of society and so on. So how do we explain these two? Well, Lawrence Miller classes these two as psychopathic shooters, okay, who were psychopathic from basically the onset, okay. From early in life, they were difficult to socialize, and even though they came from good backgrounds, okay, they were so difficult to socialize that it wasn't enough, okay, because from an early age, they were hyperactive, they were fearless, they were stimulation seeking, okay. Perhaps because of some other brain abnormalities, they didn't fear condition, perhaps a defected amygdala. They didn't experience much empathy, shame, guilt, remorse, and so on, okay. So in these cases, obviously, biology likely has more of a role to play, okay, both in the cases of the psychopathic shooters and of the psychotic shooters, right? Because there wasn't a bad environment, so we can't use that to make sense of what happened. So using biological factors is likely to give us more insight. So this paves the way for the social push hypothesis, which originates from Raine's '98 paper. Now, I've showed you already a whole bunch of brain scan studies that Raine's done. We've compared a multiple murderer to single murderers. We've compared reactive killers to proactive killers. And in this study, he compared those killers from a bad home versus those from a good home. So he's determining good home versus bad home based upon a 5-point scale on physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, all these other characteristics you can see here. And then they're being checked against reports from psychologists, courtroom files, transcripts from legal proceedings, and so on, interviews with the lawyers involved, medical reports, newspaper reports, anything else that's going to give insight into the case. The overall inter-rater reliability is about 0.9, okay? So that's good evidence that they're being categorized correctly into good home versus bad home. So the results of this are that there are 12 killers from a bad background or deprived background, 26 from a good background or non-deprived, and then 41 average controls, okay, non-killers. So what the brain scans reveal, this is the same design as we've already looked at, okay? It's a PET scanner measuring brain activity during a cognitive task. And the control group show what we would expect, right? Good prefrontal cortex activation. And actually, the bad home group, on average, also have good frontal lobe activity, okay? It is the good home group that have the impairments clearly visible in the frontal lobe. So This is where the social push hypothesis comes from, because in Raine's conclusion in this paper is that the biology is what's explaining the bad behavior, right? What's explaining bad behavior in this middle group? Well, they came from bad homes, right? You don't have to look much further than that. But this final group who come from good homes, well, you would predict in that group, that's when biology plays a role. And that's what the evidence from this paper suggests, that yes, there is some cognitive frontal lobe impairment, right, that might be contributing to reactive violence, okay, including reactive homicides. So this is the origin of the social push hypothesis, right? That in some cases, even when the social factors are average, biology is going to push that aside, okay, and biology is going to increase the odds of the violent behavior. So far, we should be familiar with the social push hypothesis, moderation, the double hits effect, and be able to give examples of each. And what I lastly want to discuss is examples of mediation, okay? In which, again, X is associated with Y, okay? But it's an indirect relationship and it's being impacted or explained by something else. So in this case, what the researchers have found is that the volume of the amygdala is mediating the relationship between social adversity and developing callous unemotional traits. Okay, so social adversity is basically social disadvantages that are being assessed on this scale, measuring the parents' education, unemployment, whether the mother was a teenager when she had the child, and so on. Okay, these other markers of social disadvantages. So, you know, we know that having these social disadvantages increases the odds of callous unemotional traits, but why? Many people come from similar backgrounds and turn out just fine, right? They don't turn out to have these callous unemotional traits. So the relationship is mediated by other factors, right? And in this paper, the volume of the amygdala is one of those explanatory factors. So we already know that a smaller amygdala increases the odds of having callous unemotional traits, right? We've looked at that. The amygdala is responsible for the pairing of stimuli, conditioning, fear conditioning, right? It's the center point for emotion. So if you have a less active or smaller amygdala, you're not going to respond in the same way to emotional events as the average person does, right? And you won't fear condition as the typical person does. So we've already looked at how that increases the odds of callous unemotional traits. But also, social adversity increases the odds that the amygdala will be smaller, okay? And we looked at that too, right? We looked at the fact that poverty, abuse, neglect, a wide range of early stresses in life that are persistent will have a negative impact on the volume of the amygdala. So in this case, social adversity is impacting the amygdala is impacting callous unemotional traits, and it's explaining about 8% of the relationship between social adversity and callous unemotional traits, okay? So you understand, right, the difference in mediation. This impacts the mediator, right, which then impacts the outcome. If it's a moderator, right, the predictor does not impact the moderator. That's the key difference, right? What also about neighborhoods, coming from a bad neighborhood? So in this paper, they're looking at the effects of race. It's comparing African Americans to Caucasians. Now, you likely already know that African Americans are more likely to be convicted for crimes in this country, a wide range of factors going into explaining that. But in this study, one explanatory factor was coming from a bad neighborhood, okay? Because African Americans in this country are more likely to come from a bad neighborhood than a white person is, okay, statistically. How are we determining what's a bad neighborhood? In this paper, we're looking at the number of vacant housing units in the neighborhood, how much of the neighborhood is below the poverty line, how many single families or single female household families there are, how many of the neighborhood are below 18 years of age. Again, another wide range of markers for what might be indicators over poverty in that neighborhood. Okay, so in this case, race had an impact on neighborhood, okay, meaning that if you were black, you were more likely to come from a bad neighborhood than the white participants. And then this has had an impact on executive functions, okay? It's a small effect, okay, in comparison to the others. There's plenty of smart people who come from bad backgrounds, right? But it's a small effect and it's significant. Why? Well, if you come from a bad background, maybe the schools will have less resources. Maybe the student population will be larger in comparison to the number of teachers. There's going to be perhaps less access to good food, less access to minerals and the other nutritions that we've talked about. There might be, if it's an area in poverty, more exposure to lead and heavy metals from factories and so on, and these all might have negative impacts on the brain. So there's a whole range of factors as to why coming from a bad neighborhood might negatively impact executive functions, right? So in this study, just this one pathway alone explains 11% of the association between race and then antisocial acts, okay? So the race impacted the neighborhoods you came from, neighborhood impacted executive functions, and then executive functions impact antisociality. And we've looked at a number of sources of evidence for that, right? The impairments to executive function, whether it be, impact on impulse control, impact on problem solving, impact on decision making, and so on. Any one of these could impact the odds of antisociality. And then one last mediation example I want to mention is heart rate as a mediator. So in this case, we have social adversity again, increasing the odds of delinquency, this time in the teenage years. But in this case, low resting heart rate is explaining about 20% of the relationship as a mediator. Now, we know that low resting heart rate increases the odds of delinquency. We've looked at that, right, in relation to the stimulation-seeking theory, the fearlessness theory, right? It might be uncomfortable, you might seek out stimulation, or the fearlessness might mean that you're more likely to go ahead with something that for other people, they would be too afraid to do so, right? They don't experience the same deterrence. But why might social adversity impact heart rate in this study? Think about what I told you about cortisol at the beginning of the course. It's something similar. Yeah.
Maybe if you're coming from like a bad neighborhood, you're more likely to experience like traumatic events, and you're more likely to be able to process those emotions better because you've been experiencing those already.
Okay.
That would lead to a lower heart rate overall.
Okay. Better probably isn't the word I would use, right? But you mean that you're going to get more used to traumatic events,
Right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. If you come from a background in which you're exposed to more stress, for most people, those stressful situations would increase heart rate. They would cause a fight or flight response. But if you're exposed to this on a daily basis, okay, the effect is going to numb, right? You're going to get used to it because the body adapts, okay? And it will no longer produce a substantial increase in heart rate, right? It won't have the same stress response in you as it would in a typical person. So in this case, yes, coming from a social adverse background has lowered heart rate, and then this lower heart rate has increased the odds of delinquency. And this has explained 20% of the relationship, okay? Any questions so far? Okay, what I'd like you to do is in groups of about 3, search this case online of Stephen Parkes. And as I did at the beginning for Henry Lee Lucas, listing his social and biological risk factors, you do the same for Stephen Parkes, okay? So researching what you can, begin listing the social factors, biological, how they might have interacted, and what do you think explains his criminal behavior.